Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special evening with a very distinguished guest. Sir Terence Clark is a former British diplomat who spent much of his career in the Middle East. After studying Arabic at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and at the Middle East Center of Arab Studies in Lebanon, he served in the Gulf, in the Levant or Greater Syria, and in the Maghreb, with intervals in the Foreign Office and in Europe. In 1985, he was appointed ambassador to Iraq during a very difficult time, that when the Iraq-Iran war was going on. And despite the restrictions imposed on travel for foreign diplomats, he managed to find ways of exploring the length and the breadth of Iraq and came to know the country probably much better than many Iraqis. I agree with that. He has written, lectured, and broadcast about the history of Britain and Iraq, and was even interviewed for an Arabic and Iraqi channel in Arabic. He spoke in Arabic, in Iraqi slang, and actually, may I add, the interviewer was the director of this Iraqi Cultural Centre, Dr. Abdurrahman Diab. Tonight, Sir Terence Clark is going to speak to us in English about his experiences in getting to know Iraq, its places and its people and its history. Please give a very warm welcome to a very distinguished diplomat, a gentleman, and above all, a great lover of Iraq.
شكرا جزيلا مساء الخير. With the periodic media accounts of suicide bombers, murders, violence in Iraq, it's all too easy to see this country only in terms of violence and destruction. There is, however, another side, and what I call the eternal side of Iraq, on which I shall concentrate this evening. I must say I feel slightly nervous because I see many faces in the audience who know Iraq possibly better than I do, but we shall see. I also have to give a health warning before I start, because some of the pictures I'm going to show you this evening were taken about 100 years ago by Gertrude Bell, or Miss Bell, as you call her, and the quality today is not so good. So in March 1985, my wife and I, who's here this evening, set off from London to drive to Baghdad on my appointment as ambassador, little imagining then that we would spend the next 5 years until January 1990 in Iraq. During those tumultuous years of the Iraq-Iran war and its aftermath, I visited almost every town of any significance, from Zakho in the north to Basra in the south, and Rutba in the west to Khanaqin in the east, and much of the country in between. This country we call today Al-Iraq, but it was of course previously called Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers, or as the British troops, when they came to Iraq in the First World War, they called it simply Mess Pot. Our initiation was not encouraging. Before leaving London, many of my friends said, "Oh, you poor fellow, going to Iraq, a country then under a brutal regime of Saddam Hussein that was locked in a war of attrition with Iran." As we drove across Turkey, the news became increasingly alarming with reports of Iranian air raids on Baghdad airport, to which British Airways announced they would stop flying. Our daughter was supposed to be arriving there from school about a week later. Meanwhile, the road on which we were traveling to the Iraqi border became an absolute nightmare. As in pouring rain, we struggled through a never-ending stream of oil tankers coming out of Iraq and equally heavily laden juggernauts, heavy lorries, traveling in the opposite direction with all the imports which could no longer enter by the port of Basra, which was closed. Worse was to come. Having reached with an enormous sigh of relief our new home in Baghdad, we suffered in the middle of our very first night the shattering experience of an Iranian missile. The first of 69 missiles while we were there. What a welcome to Baghdad, known in Arabic, of course, as Dar es-Salam, the city of peace. My predecessor as ambassador had described to me the state of virtual siege in which he had worked, as much of the area around the embassy in Kirkuk, with its typical Shanashil. Sorry, that was the explosion, the first explosion we encountered on the Rafidin Bank in Shari' al-Nahar. You may recall that.
Of course, yes.
This is a more typical view, which was just outside the embassy compound. Most of these houses, sadly, had been demolished and redeveloped, and a diplomatic service, British diplomatic service inspector, made a very critical report of the deterioration of the fabric of the former Ottoman mansion known as Qasr Qadim Pasha, which had housed our diplomatic representation since it was purchased in 1921. It was therefore with some trepidation that I paid my first visit to the embassy. It proved, however, an unexpectedly uplifting experience. The area round about Haifa Street had been transformed into a clean, modern estate with wide-treed boulevards and well-designed buildings. The embassy was being refurbished, and I felt a thrill as I passed through the door of my office, where many illustrious names in British diplomacy had sat and looked out over the mighty Tigris. On the other side of the river stood a number of buildings that were of particular interest. First, there was the once imposing edifice of the former British Residency. This photograph by Gertrude Bell was taken in 1911 and shows the then British diplomats' mode of transport, a rather nice yacht. Sadly, they didn't supply me with one. You must bear in mind that Britain has had commercial, consular and diplomatic representation in Iraq from as early as 1635, and that for much of this long relationship our affairs were in the hands of the East India Company and later the British government in India, so that the old administrative titles from the days of the British Raj lingered on in Iraq until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I asked for, and rather to my surprise, was given permission to visit this former centre of British imperialism, which had lost the upper story and had been converted into the Museum of National Costume. As I was shown around, I was amused to hear from my enthusiastic guide that this room had been the office of Miss Bell, and that room the office of Cocos, as Gertrude Bell, the Oriental Councillor, and Sir Percy Cox were known popularly in Iraq 60 years previously. I tried to find Miss Bell's house, but it had been replaced by a modern building. That's how it looked in 1920 when her father visited her. Together, Sir Percy Cox and Gertrude Bell had been instrumental in acquiring Qasr Kadhim Pasha as the offices of the British High Commission until the appointment of the first British ambassador in 1921. To one side, a residence was built for Sir Percy Cox and his wife, which was sadly destroyed by the mob in the revolution in 1958. Only the billiard room remained, which became the embassy club. However, inside the courtyard of the embassy, I arranged to have re-erected the bronze coat of arms and a plaque that had once formed part of the equestrian monument to General Maude. I think maybe some of the older members here will remember the statue of General Maude up there, which stood on a roundabout just in front of the embassy. The monument was put up to him as the liberator of Baghdad from the Turks in 1917, but it was torn down in the revolution and destroyed. We also erected in the courtyard of the embassy this plaque, which once stood in the former British Consulate General in Basra, commemorating 20 members of the Chesney expedition who had perished near Ana on the Euphrates in a terrible storm when they were trying to examine the possibilities for navigation on the Euphrates. I was intrigued to discover that standing immediately next to the old High Commission in Rusafa was the house of the first Iraqi Prime Minister, Sayyid Abdurrahman al-Gilani. And I'm glad to see his, is it granddaughter or great-granddaughter? Great-granddaughter here this evening. And it was not hard to see why many Iraqis thought that whatever the appearances of independence, the British were still directing affairs, as indeed they were. Even when the High Commission moved across the river to Kirkuk, the Iraqis noted little change in British influence and called him Mukhtar Dak as-Sob, which perhaps can be loosely translated as the boss across the river. Jokingly, Iraqis would sometimes refer to me as ambassador by this title, or as Abu Naji, a nickname for the British which seems to have derived from Gertrude Bell, a friend whose friend and mentor in local affairs was also called Naji. Interestingly, when the British troops landed in Basra in 2003, they were called by the local people Abu Naji. So the name has lingered on. I was even more intrigued to discover just a little further along the Rusafa side of the river a much earlier British residency. This is how it looked in the 19th century, which was once occupied by the great British Orientalist Claudius James Rich, who was the first British Consul General from 1808 to 21. The building had been converted into a hotel but it had been sadly demolished to be replaced by the present Baghdad Chamber of Commerce. However, next to it stood the home of the residency surgeon, which I was astonished to hear was still called, 150 years later, Beit al-Hakim, the doctor's house, which stands, I think, next to the present Gilani house in Shari al-Nahr. Opposite it was another imposing building, still called Beit Lynch, or Lynch, after the British Lynch family, who had set up the first navigation company operating on the Tigris in 1841. Further along the waterfront stands an even older relic of Baghdad, the reconstructed complex of buildings originally built by the Abbasids, whose caliphs ruled the Arab world from Baghdad in the 9th to the 13th centuries. Known collectively as Al-Mustansiriyya, after its founder, the Caliph Mansur, known as Al-Mustansir Billah. As this surviving Kufic inscription tells us, it contained 4 large law schools for the 4 orthodox sects of Islam, a magnificent library, a hospital, and other ancillary buildings. The Mongols, under Hulagu, largely destroyed it in 1258. But some of the buildings were still in use as the customs until after the First World War. Saddam restored the complex to some of its former glory, and it became a museum. Just beyond the Mustansiriyya, a modern bridge now spans the Tigris, but for centuries before, there was only a pontoon bridge, which was known as the Bridge of Boats, or the Old Bridge. Many of the British travellers to Baghdad would come down the river from Mosul on a raft made of goat skins, and it was called a kelik. They would land at this bridge, make their way to the British residency for some home comforts after the rigours of their journey. Wartime restrictions prevented me from making this journey on the river, which remained nonetheless the focus of city life. By night, the banks were alive with cafes and restaurants specializing in the preparation of mazgouf. I don't need to tell anybody here what mazgouf is like, but we thought it was delicious.
We ordered the dinner in your honor, sir.
By day, a stroll along the souk in Shari al-Nahr would bring me into contact with all the sights, the smells and the sounds of the Orient, and 1 or 2 unusual features reflecting the cosmopolitan makeup of this big city. One favorite was John the Baptist, a silversmith making the distinctive Amara silverware, a trade which was peculiar to members of the sect known as Sabaeans or Mandeans, or mistakenly by Westerners as Christians of St. John the Baptist. This little-known sect in the West, neither Christian nor Muslim, had their own Syriac-type language and required running water for their rites, so they tended to be found living along the twin rivers. I once saw a Sabaean wedding performed by the side of the embassy, in which the bride and the groom and their families and friends, all dressed in pure white, entered into the river and immersed themselves in the muddy water. Strangely, it did not seem to dampen their enthusiasm. Further down the souk were the carpet cleaners, who pounded Persian rugs with poles to beat out the dust before scrubbing them with persil and dousing them with water from the river. Always a colourful and vibrant sight. In the stream of people came vendors with trolleys selling whatever fruit and vegetables were in season, including such unfamiliar delicacies as nabuk, no nabuk, chimme,
That's truffle.
shalgam, or even a cup of coffee with hayr, with cardamom. The physiognomies of the people showed their different origins. They were tall Bedouin. We have a wonderful example at the back there this evening, in a rather better abba than this one.
هذا ينفصل، هذا بدوي واحنا عشائر.
تمام.
عشائر البدو مختلف.
صح. So there would be the Bedouin in their wonderful cloaks. There would be broad-shouldered Kurds carrying enormous loads on their back. Here's one carrying a steel girder. And there would be black-gowned women fluttering by, some with tribal tattoos like this one. Others had blue eyes, betraying perhaps their Caucasian blood. And here and there were flat faces with slit eyes, showing that the Mongols too had left their legacy. The end point of our stroll was always the carpet souk. Here it was always peaceful, and the merchants, who became our friends, would often offer tea or other refreshment and show us their latest acquisitions. Pilgrims have, of course, for centuries come to Baghdad and to the holy cities of Karbala, Najaf and Samarra, and would sell their rugs to pay their way. Rugs have also been traded with the Caucasus and Iran and manufactured locally by the Kurds in the north and the Bedouin around Samawa in the south. So there was always the prospect of learning about the different types and occasionally of finding something unusual to buy. And the souk was also a good place to get the feel of how the real economy worked, because going to the foreign ministry or the Ministry of Trade, we were never told anything about what was really going on. In preparation for a conference of the non-aligned heads of state in 1980, the government had set in train a vast program of public works to redevelop the city. These included looping highways, monumental public buildings, luxury hotels, a vast conference center, and so on. Most of them were completed just in time for the Iraqi invasion of Iran, and the conference was never held. The projects were, in the main, well designed and an embellishment to the city, such as the great split heart commemorating the fallen martyrs. But I never really liked the monument to the unknown soldier, with its appearance of a half-open oyster shell. However, such critical thoughts were always banished by the appearance of the military in their splendid ceremonial uniforms, very reminiscent of the British Raj. The nearest attraction for an afternoon's visit outside Baghdad was the great arch at Kesi, attributed to the Sasanian king Khosrow I, who reigned in the middle of the 6th century AD. It is probable, however, that he rebuilt the ruin of the 3rd century Sasanian king Sapor. The arch is still said to be the widest single-span vault of unreinforced brickwork in the world. It stands over 33 meters high and more than 23 meters across. The arch suffered some damage during the hostilities in 1991, but I believe not seriously. The nuclear reactor nearby Salman Park suffered rather more damage by the Israelis in a preemptive attack some years before. About 100 kilometers north of Baghdad, on the east bank of the Tigris, stands Samarra, which was a great favorite of ours. Samarra is one of the 4 most important places of pilgrimage for the Shia, who came to worship under the golden dome of the shrines of the 10th and 11th Imams, Ali al-Hadi and Hassan al-Askari. As a Shia mosque, we were not allowed inside, so our goal was always Old Samarra. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim decided he didn't like Baghdad and built at Samarra a magnificent new capital which for some 60 years in the 9th century was the wonder of the age. It was meticulously planned on a geometric grid system with 20-mile-long boulevards dividing up the palaces, residential and commercial areas, mosques, barracks, stadium, even a racetrack. Much of it was being excavated and restored while we were there, and the great spiral minaret of the vast Friday Mosque, clearly echoing the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, and the Caliph's palaces on both sides of the river, conveyed some idea of its earlier grandeur. Samarra is said to derive from the Arabic Surra man ra'a, happy was he who saw it. However, for the nearly 10,000 British and Indian soldiers captured by the Turks at Kut al-Amara in one of the most ignominious defeats of the First World War, it cannot have been a happy sight. They were conveyed here by train, and as the tracks ended there, they were forced to walk to imprisonment in Turkey. Most of them succumbed to fatigue and disease on the way. Iraq has many legacies from the First World War, such as the cemeteries full of memorials to men from Indian army units with such evocative names as Skinner's Horse. One of the most curious monuments was this one to General Maude, shaped like Cleopatra's Needle here in London. I discovered it on a mountain top in Jabal Hamreen. It was then falling to pieces and probably has disappeared altogether by now. Within half a day's drive south of Baghdad, there were so many archaeological sites that we were spoilt for choice. I took very seriously my duties as honorary vice president of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq and tried to visit all the sites with which British archaeologists were associated. These visits were made all the more pleasurable and useful when digging was going on. Then we could use the dig camp as a base for seeing all around the district where normally there were few facilities for visitors. So we visited the great ziggurat at Agar Guf, still standing 16 meters high, though it was much higher when it was built as the focus of the great Kassite city in the 2nd millennium BC. It was here that I thought I had made a great archaeological discovery. I was walking along and saw in the sand what I thought was a gold necklace. I bent it down to pick it up with great excitement. It turned out to be a child's plastic ball. I was very sad. From there to Babylon and its famous lion was only a short distance, but the contrast could not have been sharper. Babylon covers a vast area, only a fraction of which has been excavated. When we first went there, it required an expert guide to distinguish the mud brick foundations from the piles of dirt and sand which the earlier excavators had piled up. By the time we left Iraq, Babylon had been rebuilt by an army of Sudanese and Egyptian laborers with dazzling yellow bricks up to a height of 30 meters or more. It was rumored that every fifth brick bore the name of Saddam Hussein in emulation of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled Babylon in the 7th century BC. Saddam liked to present himself as one of his direct descendants. And one evening, when we were attending the official opening of the new Babylon, an incident occurred that must have caused a few heads to roll. Dominating the opening ceremony of a procession of young men and women in Babylonian costumes were two tall palm trees, each bearing a huge portrait in profile, Nebuchadnezzar to the left, bearing a strange resemblance to Saddam on the right. But suddenly, Saddam's portrait began to slip slowly down the tree. Little figures could be seen trying to pull it up again, but to no avail. Was this the curse of Nebuchadnezzar on his impostor? We shall never know. After the winter in Iraq, which could be surprisingly cold and wet, it was always a delight to head north in time for the Kurdish spring festival of Nowruz. The countryside would be green and covered with wildflowers for a brief period before the onset of the ferocious heat of summer. One such time found me near Sheikh Adi, the spiritual center of the Yazidis, and I joined them in their festivities. The Yazidis are a strange sect whose origins are lost in obscurity. They speak a dialect of Kurdish, but they are not Muslims. They baptize with the Christians. They abstain with the Jews from unlawful foods, and they abhor with the Mandeans the color blue. They follow a religion that requires them to honor the Almighty, Allah, but also to propitiate Satan, Shaitan. Their shrine at Sheikh Adi, or Lalish, is set in a green wooded valley north of Mosul. I had to leave my car at a small stone bridge and walk the rest of the way over the holy ground in my socks. The ground was muddy, and my ambassadorial feet looked less than dignified as I sat down cross-legged at lunch with the Mir, their hereditary leader. I was taken to the sanctuary, whose doorway is decorated with mystic signs, including a large black snake. Inside it was pitch black, except for a little light in one corner from a lamp to illuminate the simple tomb of Sheikh Adi. My guide was a villainous-looking eunuch with long ringlets hanging from his temples. He was in charge of the sanctuary and the women who worked there. That's why he was a eunuch. I was happy for him to lead me out into the sunlight again, onto the neighboring shrine of Sheikh Shamsuddin, below whose fluted dome was a pool of crystal clear water, fed, it was said, direct from the sacred spring of Zamzam in Mecca. As I was looking at the pool, an old man pushed me out of the way and proceeded to wash himself in the water, holy or not. The mountainous area around Mosul is full of strange sects. For example, the Shabak, who are believed to be Kurdish Shia, but have their own dialect and no mosques. Some believe they are descended from the Mongols, but they do not look like it. However, there is another minority of Faili Kurds who are Shia and were heavily persecuted under Saddam. Then there are all kinds of Christians, Nestorians, whom some call Assyrians, and Jacobites, with their corresponding Uniate branches, Syrian Catholics and Chaldeans. I was fortunate enough to be present when the Chaldean patriarch, Rufail, was installed in a glittering open-air ceremony attended by representatives of the many communities in Australia and the United States and elsewhere. As these ancient Christian communities emigrate to these distant lands, both through economic necessity and increasingly Muslim fanaticism, so their once flourishing churches and monasteries decline. We used to go to Deir Matte, a Jacobite monastery not far from Mosul, which stands high on a hill with a sweeping view down to the plain below. With only a handful of monks left, it continued only with a heavy government subsidy, and was visited on high days and holidays by local people of different religious persuasions. Unlike Iraq today, Iraq then was a religiously tolerant country where the different sects lived peacefully side by side and often joined in each other's festivities. Just a few kilometers away to the southeast is one of the most impressive sites in Iraq, the great Assyrian capital at Nimrud. In the middle of the 19th century, the British archaeologist Austin Layard excavated the colossal winged bull men and stone reliefs with scenes from the triumph of the Assyrian kings with such ringing names as Sargon, Ashurbanipal and Shalmaneser, which now amaze visitors to the British Museum, where they have been re-erected. Fortunately, some of the reliefs were reburied and excavated again a century later by another generation of British archaeologists under Max Mallowan, to be exposed in situ for the Iraqis to see. Max Mallowan was, of course, the husband of Agatha Christie, who wrote her book Murder in Mesopotamia while she was based there. And one day we went to see where she used to do her writing, a small mud brick room on the site. The key was produced, the door was opened, and we were told hanging on the door was her straw hat. Sadly, it wasn't there. But her little wooden desk and her chair were still there to this day, of that day. Some while later, the same Iraqi archaeologist, Muzahim Mahmoud, may be known to you, who showed us around, noticed a depression in the tile floor of one of the palace buildings. Suspecting a chamber underneath, he instituted a dig and was rewarded with the most spectacular find of kilos of dazzling gold jewelry, ornamenting the remains of an Assyrian princess. To the southwest of Mosul lies an equally but differently impressive site, the great city of Hadra. It is generally ascribed to the Parthians, but its origins go back much farther to Assyrian times. It is unlike any other site in Iraq because the monumental buildings are built of stone rather than mud brick. The Greeks and the Romans were here, and their influence can be seen in their statuary to their gods. Apollo, Hercules, Eros, Hermes, Poseidon, they're all there. Hatra survived many attacks in its history, but finally succumbed to the Sasanian king Sapor in 241 AD, and was left as a ruin until restoration in modern times. In Mosul itself, we often dropped in at the British dig house whenever teams from the British Museum were staying there. It was set inside the walls of another Assyrian capital, of Sennacherib at Nineveh. Little remains above ground to indicate the splendor of the palaces, libraries and gardens he built, but the still high walls that once surrounded the city. On one visit, the British archaeologists uncovered one of the gates into the city, which had collapsed in an onslaught, burying the soldiers with their equipment, never to see the light again for 2,400 years. An onslaught of a different kind took place on the former British consulate in Mosul. In April 1939, demonstrators had stormed the building, believing nationalist propaganda that the British had been implicated in the death of King Ghazi in a driving accident. The consul, Mr. Monk Mason, had gone out onto the steps to reason with the crowd, but he was felled by a blow from a pickaxe with such force that it not only killed the consul, but also knocked a large hole in the steps where he was standing. I discovered the old consulate with its distinctive crenellated roof, still standing not far from the railway station. The owner kindly showed me around and referred to his sitting room as Ghurfat al-Gunsul, and the adjacent room was Ghurfat al-Muhasib. To this day, very strange. He confirmed that the hole in the steps had been there when he bought the house, but he had repaired the damage. I later found Mr. Monk Mason's grave in a little cemetery just off the road to Tel Afar, to the west of Mosul. Tel Afar was itself another jewel to explore. It is a mainly Turkoman town, dominated by a restored Ottoman castle. From its flat roof, you have one of the most evocative views as the sun sets to the west over the great plain of the Jazira, throwing into relief more than 200 archaeological mounds, each representing an occupied site in antiquity. Only a fraction of these mounds have been excavated. Nowhere else in Iraq, a country so abundant in archaeological sites, offers such a striking panorama of continuous civilization over millennia. British archaeologists were excavating one of these mounds called Tel El Hawa, and it was a moment of great excitement on my first visit there to stumble on a piece of cuneiform, khat mismari, which identified that part of the site as a temple restored by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III in the 9th century BC. And there it was, right on the surface. I once drove right across the Jazira from Tel Afar to the Euphrates and found Chinese engineers building a great network of raised canals to carry sweet water and ditches for saline water to irrigate what was planned to be Iraq's breadbasket. The Euphrates had already been dammed in 2 places, creating an enormous lake at Haditha, where great water wheels once lifted the water from the river to irrigate the land. Another lake was forming behind the dam at Ana, and we hurried to explore the picturesque old town before its 14th century mosque and its much older synagogue disappeared forever beneath the water. The mosque, with its distinctive octagonal minaret, was rescued by sawing into sections for re-erecting in new Ana, but the synagogue and many other fine old buildings were inundated forever. Lower down the Euphrates, we mounted an expedition to retrace the old camel mail route that once came that way from Damascus. We started from a pretty oasis called Ain Za'zur and struck out due west to find the old staging posts along the route. The brother of my good friend Dr. Thabit al-Hiti, who is here this evening in the front row, kindly guided us to the first staging post at Qasr Khubbaz, where we camped the night with the words ringing in our ears about a wolf that had killed some 50 sheep there a day or so before. We saw the huge wolf footpads in the mud. Another Bedouin led us on to the next staging post in the desert at Amij, where his family was camped. And his wife was weaving on this loom. From there we navigated across the sands to Wadi Hawra, down to Rutba, an interesting town in the triangle bounded by Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Syria. It has been an important staging post for centuries, as the stone-lined Roman wells bear witness. We set out to find the old rest house of the Neon Bus Company, which after the First World War until the 1950s ran a regular service, first of cars like this beautiful old Rolls-Royce, and later of articulated buses from Beirut to Damascus and then across the desert to Baghdad. We found a 4-square crenellated building that looked right and was right, though it was now a police station. Nevertheless, I asked at the door whether we might look round, and a delighted commander of the police showed us round the former travellers' rooms, which had been turned into cells for prisoners in the central courtyard. And I was amused to find a yellowing notice stuck on one of the walls with the price of haircuts for Neon travellers in shillings and pence. From Rutba back to Baghdad, there is now a 6-lane highway, but it follows the old Neon route to Fallujah and Ramadi. And between these two towns stands a restored Khan, or caravanserai, one of many along the main routes across Iraq. This one is known as Khan Nuqta, or Khan Dari. It was here that on the 12th of August 1920, a distinguished British Army officer, Colonel Gerald Leachman, or Leishman as he's known, was murdered by a shot in the back at the order of the local Sheikh Dari. It was a signal for a revolt of the tribes along the Euphrates, and for a while anarchy reigned. Other pilgrim Khans we used to visit was Khan Aruba and Khan Anuth, respectively a quarter and half the way from Karbala to Najaf. Sometimes we would strike out across the desert to Khan al-Atshan, which is believed to have been an Abbasid hunting palace. And from there we would navigate our way across the sand to the lonely Abbasid tower called Minar Jidda, before dropping down towards the shimmering waters of Lake Razaza. Here stands the 8th century Arab castle of Ukhaydar, and close by the ruins of a 4th century church, as a reminder that at that time the Arab tribes in the area were Christian. Once when we were camping there, we were woken by a great commotion as my Slugis had ambushed a very fierce wildcat. Khayriya. Tamam? Today, places such as Karbala, Najaf and Kufa are frequently in the news as hotbeds of Shia fanaticism, but for us they were easily accessible. And on one occasion, one of the Sayyids, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, volunteered to take us exceptionally as non-Muslims inside the shrine of Imam Hussein bin Ali, who was martyred here in 680 AD in a battle that led to the great divide between the Sunnis and the Shia. The shrine lies beneath a shimmering golden dome on the outside and a glittering mirror mosaic in the muqarnas or stalactite style on the inside. Around the tomb itself, supplicants clung to the surrounding grille whispering prayers, perhaps for someone they had recently buried in the closely packed cemetery nearby in the Wadi as-Salam, where the gravestones in serried ranks point in the direction of Mecca. The photographs of young men attached to them bore silent witness to the thousands of casualties in the war with Iran. And by now there are surely many thousands more. In 1991, Saddam's Revolutionary Guards opened fire on the shrine with tanks as people fled there for sanctuary during the uprising of the Shia in the aftermath of the liberation of Kuwait. The mosque and the adjacent mosque of Imam Abbas were both damaged, but have since been restored. One day we drove into Karbala and were astonished to see that the square near the shrine was covered with thousands of live ducks and coots, secured by strings around their legs. It was the migration season, and they had been caught in the marshes. We later arranged a trip into the marshes, which were accessible only in daylight, as by night they were the haunt of marauding bands of deserters and rebels. Even so, we had to have an armed escort as we took to the water in one of the elegant high-prowed canoes that conveyed us through the narrow passages in the high reeds. Here and there were clearings where the marsh Arabs had established a few of their arched, thatched houses, Nadif, and eked out a living from fishing and the husbandry of water buffalo. Of course, we had to go to see the showplace of Saddam's village, to which piped water and electricity had been supplied, as well as a floating school and clinic. In a later act of vandalism that exceeded even the firing of Kuwait's oil fields, Saddam's regime drained the marshes, thereby destroying the whole way of life of the marsh Arabs and the ecosystem on which they and so many forms of wildlife depended. Since the fall of Saddam, some of the marsh Arabs have returned. Dr. Alwash, some of you may know, and has set about flooding the area again in order to resume their old way of life. Remarkably, patches of marshland have been recreated, though it is a question whether it will ever be the same again, or whether the marsh Arabs will wish to go back to their picturesque but primitive existence. From the marshes, the nearest place to stay was Basra. It could, however, be a dangerous place then, as it was within easy shelling distance of Iran. Basra was the place where British involvement in Iraq began through the East India Company in 1635. I could not find any traces of the old residency or the coaling station we once had there, but I did locate the former British Consulate General, now a shell-torn museum of natural history. I also found the old Shuttle Arab Hotel, still full of relics of those former colonial times when visitors from India invariably stayed there. Before leaving Iraq, I was determined to fill in 2 remaining blanks on the map of British diplomatic representation: the former consulate in Kirkuk and the vice consulate at Diana. Kirkuk was easy to visit, as we had dealings from time to time with the oil company there. I was unable to find the old consulate, but it was like stepping back half a century when I entered the oil company's clubhouse. The wood-panelled bar and furniture dated back to that era when the largely British-owned Iraq Petroleum Company, IPC, ran operations here. Some of the older engineers spoke nostalgically of the good old days, though they were justly proud of their proven ability to run the show by themselves. Of course, we had to go to the famous Baba Gurgur well, where it all began in the late 1920s, to see the oil bubbling up through the ground as it had been doing since far back in antiquity. Kirkuk Citadel is also famous as one of several places claiming to be the oldest site of continuous human occupation. It stands on a high mound dominating the town and once held a colourful community predominantly of Kurds and Turkmen. But it was deliberately and roughly Arabized by Saddam's regime to ensure the loyalty of the people in such an economically vital area. And thus, the seeds were sown for the present dispute over control of the town. Getting to Diana was much more difficult, as it lies in the Rawanduz Gorge, not far from the border with Iran. Although by then the war with Iran was over, it remained a sensitive area. My Kurdish driver and I drove from Slimaniye to Erbil, which also lays claim to be the oldest continuously inhabited town, and Sarsang, once a ski resort, to enter the gorge. It was late in the year, and the autumnal colours of the trees on the steep slopes down which torrents of water cascaded from the snow-capped mountains above was absolutely breathtaking. Eventually, we reached Diana, in a most dramatic setting, nestling on a ledge overlooking the torrent in the bottom of the gorge below. I just happened to find the village priest, an Assyrian, walking along the roadside, who took me to the site of the vice consulate. Sadly, it had been transformed into a helipad. No longer there. The post had been opened in the days of the British Mandate in Iraq, 1920 to 32, when there had been prospects of developing trade between Iraq and Iran through the gorge. It never materialized. And the lonely vice consul before the Second World War spent his time writing learned reports on the blood feuds and politics of the warring Kurds. Kurdistan today is enjoying a period of relative peace and prosperity. But when we were there, great swathes of the beautiful countryside and picturesque villages had been systematically laid waste during the infamous Anfal campaign and presented a picture of stark desolation. I personally witnessed a small hamlet being bulldozed flat, including the fruit trees, while its weeping inhabitants were ordered onto lorries with whatever they could carry to be transported to one of the soulless new so-called victory settlements that had been erected around some of the main towns. They were the lucky ones. Others were taken away and never seen again. Their fault was that they were Kurds and were automatically regarded as sympathizers of their clansmen in Iran. Many of the survivors have since gone back to try and rebuild their lives. In the limited time at my disposal this evening, I've been able to present only a few glimpses into a fascinating country, which with its long-standing British connections and its scenic attractions and antiquities would naturally appeal to visitors from Britain. I hope also that I've been able to bring back a few memories for many of you who, for whatever reasons, have left your native country to reside in Britain. Sadly, Iraq is likely to remain largely out of reach for most of us for some time to come, until the present insecurity can be brought under control. Iraq returns once more to something like a state of normality, and it will be possible for visitors, people like me, to travel freely again to meet the people.
inshallah.
Thank you.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much.